She had always been the quiet one in the room, the kind of girl who spoke less and dreamed more, the kind whose eyes stayed fixed on the glowing lines of a computer screen long after everyone else had gone to bed. She came from a small town where ambition was seen as arrogance, and girls were told that code and circuits were not meant for them. But she never listened to those whispers. She listened instead to the hum of her old laptop, the rhythm of creation. That no one else could hear. Her name was Elena Carter, and she would one day build a company that changed everything. In her early 20s, she arrived in Silicon Valley with 2 suitcases and a head full of impossible ideas. She slept on a friend's couch in Palo Alto, working nights as a freelance developer to pay rent and mornings on her own project, a simple AI engine that could predict user preferences without storing personal data. It was her rebellion against a world that treated privacy as currency. She called it Halo. Not because it was angelic, but because she wanted something pure, something that protected rather than profited. The world she entered was not kind. Investors smiled at her, then asked if her boyfriend had written the code. Venture capitalists praised her courage, but not her product, and every pitch meeting felt like walking into a storm. She would sit there surrounded by men in blue blazers, talking over her, questioning her numbers, doubting her strategy, sometimes even doubting her right to be there. But she kept going. She built her prototype with trembling hands and sleepless eyes, and when the first version of Halo worked, she cried, not out of joy, but out of relief. It meant that her voice mattered. The valley around her was built on dreams, but fed by ego. Startups rose and fell faster than sunsets. People shook hands with one another while planning exits behind smiles, and Elena saw through it all. She wanted to build something honest, something that could last. But honesty is expensive in a world that runs on perception. Her co-founder, a charismatic man named Ryan, believed in her vision, but not her values. He wanted quick growth at any cost, while she wanted long-term trust, and soon their shared dream began to fracture. One winter morning, Ryan made a deal behind her back, selling partial rights to Halo's algorithm to a marketing firm that used data for ads. When she found out, she felt like the air had been stolen from her lungs. She confronted him, and he said it was just business, that she was too emotional, that if she wanted to be taken seriously, she needed to stop acting like a girl. That sentence burned in her mind like a scar. She walked out that night in the rain, her startup almost gone, her trust shattered. She stood under a flickering streetlight and whispered to herself that maybe they were right, maybe she wasn't made for this world. But then she remembered the little girl who sat in front of a broken laptop dreaming of something better. She decided that she would rebuild, even if she had to start from nothing. And she did. She rented a small office above a coffee shop, the kind of space where paint peeled off the walls, but ideas grew wild. She worked 16 hours a day, eating instant noodles, surrounded by stacks of code notes and sticky reminders to breathe. She didn't have investors, she didn't have backup. All she had was faith and fury, and an idea that still refused to die. She rebuilt Halo line by line, this time stronger, smarter, cleaner, and she began reaching out to women engineers, designers, and coders who had been overlooked by big companies. They joined her not because of money, but because of belief. They called themselves the Rebuilders. Together they worked through nights filled with laughter, exhaustion, and hope. They shared stories of rejection, of being told to smile more, to speak less, to step aside. And together they turned those stories into fire. Halo began to evolve. It was no longer just a privacy tool. It became a movement, an engine for digital trust built by women who had been told they couldn't build anything at all. Months passed, then a year. The product caught attention slowly. First a small blog, then a tech journalist, then a podcast. One day, a major corporation called, wanting to integrate Halo's technology into their systems. Elena couldn't believe it. The same kind of company that once ignored her now wanted her solution. She signed her first deal, and when the money came in, she didn't buy a car or an apartment. She bought better computers, better chairs, better lighting for her team, because she knew success meant nothing if it didn't lift others too. But Silicon Valley never forgets, and Ryan, the co-founder who had betrayed her, saw Halo's rise from afar and decided he wanted back, and he filed a claim saying he still owned part of the algorithm, that he was part of its creation. And soon Elena found herself not celebrating success, but fighting for survival again, this time not with code but in court. Courtrooms have a strange silence, the kind that wraps around your chest and squeezes until you can barely breathe. Elena sat there listening to lawyers turn her dreams into arguments. Words like intellectual property and breach of contract floated through the air like smoke. She wanted to scream that it wasn't about money, it was about integrity, about the right to own what she had created. But the world of business rarely speaks the language of Heart it speaks only profit and power, and in that world, she was still a woman fighting alone. Ryan's team came prepared. They had documents, they had connections, they had money. Elena had only her truth and a stack of evidence showing every line of code she had rewritten alone the night after he betrayed her. Still, the doubt in people's eyes hurt more than any verdict she could imagine. When she stepped outside after the first hearing, rain began to fall again. It always seemed to rain when life tested her. She looked up at the gray sky and whispered, not for victory, but for strength. She didn't want the world to hand her success. She only wanted the courage to stand in the fire without breaking. Days turned into weeks, the case dragged on, and her company suffered. Deals froze, investors hesitated, her team grew restless, some even left unable to handle the uncertainty. She understood their fear. She felt it too, but every morning she returned to that small office and kept working. She fixed bugs, wrote code, made coffee for the few who stayed, and smiled even when her hands shook. She knew that if she gave up now, everything she had endured would mean nothing. Then came the day that changed everything. During the trial, her lawyer presented time-stamped server logs showing the rebuild of Halo after Ryan's departure, proof that the algorithm had been rewritten entirely under her direction. The courtroom fell silent. Even Ryan looked shaken when the judge declared Halo the sole property of Elena Carter. Her heart didn't leap, it simply exhaled, the kind of relief that tastes like freedom. She walked out into the sunlight that day, not as a billionaire, not as a tech icon, but as a survivor. She went back to her office, hugged her small remaining team, and told them the battle was over. They had won, not against him, but against the idea that they couldn't win at all. Halo began to grow again. Partnerships returned. New investors came forward, this time women-led firms who saw not just a company, but a cause. Elena was invited to speak at conferences, at universities, at panels about women in technology. She stood there nervous but steady, sharing her story, not as a victory speech, but as a mirror for others who might be living the same fight. But as success returned, so did pressure. Expectations grew, and so did isolation. Her company reached a valuation close to $1 billion, but inside, she felt emptier than she had in years. She missed the simplicity of that first night coding with ramen and hope. She missed the laughter of her small team, who once believed purely. Now her office was glass and steel, her meetings full of charts, projections, deadlines. It was everything she had wanted, and yet somehow not what she needed. One night, she stayed late long after everyone had gone. She walked through the empty hallways and stared at the glowing Halo logo on the wall. She thought of her mother, who once told her that real success isn't measured in money, but in peace, and she realized she hadn't known peace in years. She sat by the window looking out at the valley lights and whispered to herself that maybe the climb had been more beautiful than the summit. The next morning, she called a meeting. She told her board she wanted to step down as CEO. They stared at her in disbelief. She explained that Halo no longer needed her to lead, it needed to grow beyond her shadow. She wanted to return to what she loved, creating, building, teaching. She wanted to start something new, something smaller, something human. They tried to convince her to stay, but her decision was final. A few months later, she founded a non-profit initiative that trained underprivileged girls in coding and entrepreneurship. She called it Rise because that was what every girl deserved, the chance to rise. When the world tried to push her down, she began visiting schools, small towns, even refugee camps, teaching young girls how to think and code, but more importantly, how to think they belong. Years passed, her name became legend, whispered in conference halls and coffee shops. The woman who built Halo from nothing, the founder who turned pain into purpose, the dreamer who walked away from power to give others a voice. And yet if you met her, she was simple, still wearing the same worn sneakers, still drinking cheap coffee, still coding for joy. One day during an interview, a journalist asked her if she regretted stepping away from Halo when it became a billion-dollar company. She smiled and said no, because Halo was never meant to make her rich, it was meant to prove that she could. And once she did, she realized her real purpose was to make others believe they could too. That night, she sat alone again, looking at her computer screen, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. She was working on a new open-source project, one that would give free AI tools to rural schools across the world. Outside, the rain began to fall softly. She smiled, remembering all the storms that had once made her afraid. Now the sound only made her stronger. She whispered to herself, not out of pride, but gratitude. This is what it means to build something real. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the rain, the hum of her machine, the quiet of her heart, and for the first time in years, she felt peace, not the peace of stillness, but the peace of knowing she had lived fully, fought bravely, and created something that would outlive her name.